So before I get started, my background is in the procure to pay space. I have almost 25 years experience in deploying ERP systems, predominantly PeopleSoft and Workday in the supply chain area, and with a heavy focus on procure to pay. So I've seen many customers struggle in the area of vendor onboarding or supplier onboarding. And these customers are in a variety of industries. So I've worked with customers in healthcare, financial services, banking, retail, entertainment. And the one thing that they all have in common is how do we get our vendors to onboard in a seamless way? How do we make it easy for our suppliers to integrate with our systems? How do we collect the information, and how do we make it easy not only for them but for our AP and our procurement teams? And I think so far there hasn't been one single system that's been able to solve this problem. So in today's session, we're going to talk about, well, what is really vendor onboarding and why is it important? Why are we focusing on it? And what would be the ideal solution? If we could start from scratch, what would we put into a solution to solve the issues with vendor onboarding? So I'm going to start with what? What is vendor onboarding? So vendor onboarding is the process to invite, vet, and I think, Prabhu, if we could move to the next slide. Vendor onboarding, thank you, is the process to invite, vet, and engage with your suppliers for the purposes of procuring goods and services. And it's often a multi-step process involving many individuals and many departments within your organization. The thing that makes it complicated is the initiation of that process often starts with individuals and departments who aren't in the procurement team. They don't have an overview of the policies of procurement. They initiate the process with the supplier, and then at some point they involve procurement. When procurement steps in, they need to involve other departments. They may involve legal, they may involve IT. Depending on the access that the supplier needs, they may involve security. And so many teams and many groups are involved in the procurement, in the onboarding of a supplier, which not only makes it difficult for the organization, but can make it difficult for the supplier themselves. And why is it important to streamline that process? Why is it important to make it easy to onboard a supplier? Well, you don't want to frustrate the supplier. The supplier relationship is very important. So if you look at every part of your business, whether you procure goods or services, you need your suppliers. Very similar. They need you as a customer. You also need them as a supplier. And so it's important to keep that relationship. It's also very important to vet your suppliers. You are making payments to these organizations. You want to make sure that you're making payments to the correct bank account. You want to make sure that you're not sending payments incorrectly. And so it's important that the data that you're collecting is valid and it's correct. The other thing that you want to make sure of is compliance with regulations. And I'm thinking here about 1099 data for those smaller suppliers. So you want to make sure that the information that you're collecting from the suppliers is accurate for reporting. And how do you make sure that the information is correct? You want to make sure that that information you're collecting is straight from the supplier. You don't want to get that information secondhand from people that are keying it in from your organization. Ideally, you want to collect that information directly from the supplier. And so I think we're ready to move on to the next slide. Thank you. So what are some of the challenges with vendor onboarding? I mentioned some of them in that there are many people or many departments involved in the vendor onboarding process. There's also, with the current systems, there's a lot of rigidity, and I found it's very hard for customers to be able to set up the routings and the approvals the way they want it. So, for example, the way that you want to onboard office supplier is going to be very different than the way that you onboard a supplier for your facilities, the way that you onboard a professional services supplier. And so the rules around the approvals and the routings for the different types of supplies is going to be different. So having a system to be able to change the rules depending on the type of supplier is going to be very important. So having that flexibility is going to be very important in the system. And the systems that I've worked with, I found to be extremely rigid. The other thing that's very important is to have that seamless data integration. So when a supplier enters their data into a system, having that integrate directly into your ERP system. So not having somebody take that information and having to rekey it. We all know if you have AP and rekey data into your ERP system, no, undoubtedly, it's going to be incorrect or there's going to be data keying issues. And when it comes to things like names or addresses or bank information, it's very important to get that information correct. And therefore, it's important to take that information directly from the supplier. The other thing that's very important with the onboarding information that you collect from the supplier is to make it easy for the supplier to enter that information. So the systems that I've worked with in the past, I've found that there's endless amount of questions that the supplier needs to complete. The one thing that you don't want to do is you don't want to make that difficult for the supplier. You don't want to make the onboarding process difficult for the supplier, because the next thing you'll know is that they're going to mail you a Word document with all the information that you need. And that's the last thing that you want. So the idea is to make the form extremely simple, so it takes them no time to complete it, and you've collected all the information that you need. The other thing to consider is the type of suppliers that you're onboarding. So not everybody is savvy with the computer. You might have suppliers that are mum and pop shops that may not be savvy about completing forms. So you need to have the UI very simple so it encourages them to complete the onboarding process. So that's some of the challenges with the current systems that are out there with the onboarding process. So I've touched on some of the things that we can do to overcome this. I've touched on some of the things that we can overcome with these challenges, but I'll go over a few more of them. If we could move on to the next slide, Prabhu. So I think if we could move on to the next one. So some of the things I've talked about, intuitive UI, going back to those smaller suppliers, those mum and pop shops who may not interact or often interact with systems, making the UI very simple, very intuitive. We don't want to overcomplicate it. Even for those suppliers who are using web pages on a more frequent basis, we don't want to make the form have a lot of questions in it. We want to keep it simple. The other thing that we want to make easy is there are going to be various users within the supplier that are going to interact with the system. So again, you don't know the capabilities of those individuals. So want, again, make the UI very easy. We want to have a seamless integration with the ERP system. We want to have validations upfront. We don't want the data to come into the ERP system and validate it at that point. We want to catch those errors upfront. We want to inform the user upfront that there's something wrong with the data. We want the user to correct the data upfront, not by the time it gets into the ERP system. We want to have flexible rules. So the rules, depending on the type of supplier, we want to be able to route that the information to the correct person within the organization, dependent on the type of supplier. So for example, if a supplier needs access to your data, that supplier is going to need approval from your IT department, from your security department, very different than a supplier that's taking care of your landscaping, supplier that's going to provide you office supplies. Their routing is going to be different. So we need to build in that type of flexibility. And also, we want to be able to catch duplicate suppliers up front. We don't want suppliers to go through this rigmarole only to find out later that we already have that supplier in our ERP system. So let's try and catch that supplier up front. When the requester comes in to request a supplier, let's stop them at that point. So we're not going through the whole onboarding process, only to find out later that we've already got that supplier in our system. So these are some of the things that we could consider if we were to start a new onboarding process right from scratch. So one of the things that I didn't cover off when I was talking about what onboarding does entail is, yes, onboarding is vetting your supplier. It's getting your supplier into the system. But what happens after you get your supplier into the system? What can the supplier do? Well, it would be great if the supplier would be able to see their purchase orders. It would be great if the supplier would be able to see their invoices, see their payments. They wouldn't have to call accounts payable asking, where is my payment? Why is my payment delayed? They would be able to see that their invoice is in match exception, that they charged more than that was negotiated on a PO, that their goods weren't received, that there was a delay in shipment, and so that's why their invoice hasn't been paid. Or they could see that the payment was made and it's sitting with the banks, hasn't hit their bank account yet. So that would be great for that type of information to be presented to the supplier, preventing AP from picking up those types of phone calls or answering those types of emails. So that's, even though that's not directly related to vendor onboarding, if a system could consider those types of integrations or interfaces, that would be ideal. So, thanks, Prabhu.
Excellent. Excellent, Liz. Couple of questions, right? In a given enterprise, things are always in a transition, right? So I want to give two scenarios and, love to get your perspective. One scenario is, let's say a customer is in the middle of an M&A, right? And most likely there may be duplicates in vendors, like, you may be transacting with vendors from the two different organizations. How do you go about in that scenario? Like, how would you come up with the standardization? How would you look at vendor onboarding in that type of an environment?
So how would you onboard vendors from the two organizations
Correct.
into one system?
Correct.
So yeah, you would analyze the data. Hopefully the data is clean in both systems. Oftentimes, more than not, it's somebody's got clean data, somebody's got stale data. So you would analyze the data, obviously get the clean data. You would inactivate the stale data and onboard the most recent, the most active data. Yeah. Does that answer your question?
Correct. Because that's a scenario from one of our customers. Similarly, on a, when a customer is moving from one application to the other, I know you mentioned you have worked in PeopleSoft, you have worked in Workday. When customer is in the middle of a transition, like moving from one application to the other, what are some of the considerations or best practices or even things to watch out for from your perspective?
So I think the biggest thing is analyzing your suppliers and making sure that you don't carry everyone over, doing an analysis and deciding that are you going to look at your suppliers and say, okay, anybody that I haven't had any transactions with in the last I'm only bringing people over that I've had transactions with in the last 12 months or in the last 18 months. And if I hadn't had a transaction with them beyond that time, I'm not going to carry them forward. And then even if I pick a time frame, let's say 12 months, I'm going to look at my list of suppliers in that 12 months. And I would guarantee that you have duplicate suppliers in your legacy system. Then do some analysis and identify those duplicate suppliers and only bring over one set of those suppliers, and then do a cleanup of your data so that when you start your new system, you've only got one version of active suppliers.
Got it. Got it. That makes sense. Thank you, Liz. Now, I would like to invite Girish to give a demo of the application so that you can see how the overview and the challenges and the design patterns that Liz highlighted, you can see it in action.